It might seem strange now, but this village was once the height of modern technology. Not only a place to live, it was also part of the elaborate communication system upon which trade, defence, and the social structure of 13th century Italy depended. We tend to look at the history of communication as a series of separate inventions: writing, printing, the telephone, and more recently, television and computers. This is the story of the way some of these technologies developed, one from the other, and how each development not only affected society, but was affected by it. And by looking back, we may get a glimpse of what the future holds for us. Because the latest developments in communications technology will lead to great changes in our society, and the better our understanding of them, the better equipped we shall be to deal with them. But first, a backwards glance, a look at some echoes of technologies of the past. For hundreds of years, Monteriggioni guarded the main communications link, the road, between Siena and Florence. Dante had seen this place when it was new and powerful, and when writing his famous allegory, the Inferno, he likened Monteriggioni's circle of lookout towers to giants. A warning shout from one of these towers could warn the inhabitants of possible capture or even death as they worked in the olive groves and the vineyards below. So, the village guarded the communication network, and in turn, the towers and walls helped keep the community itself safe.
Mario, vieni qua su, ti fanno la fotografia anche a te. Vieni.
The word communication is very similar to the word community. The Latin word communitas means the community. Communicare means to converse. We learned very early on to communicate through spoken language. It is this skill which distinguishes us from other creatures. But the spoken word has limitations. Words vanish as they leave our lips, or at best are recalled imperfectly from memory. We've always wanted to share and record knowledge, and the history of communication is the story of an extension in the range, speed, and precision of this process. These are some of the earliest examples of that long and complicated history. It is a story which has led unevenly and uncertainly to today's information explosion. Some say these pictures were an instinctive response to a hostile environment. Some that they reflect magic rituals. Others say that they show man learning to anticipate and to warn, to communicate emotion and instruction. All those who had seen the real animals must have understood the painted forms here. Whatever the message, putting it inside the community, like this, made it available over time to others. It became permanent. Alphabetical scripts, like ours, where the actual symbols bear little relationship to the meanings, were developed a mere 1500 years before Christ by Canaanite merchants in what we now call Syria. Later still, paper meant information could be carried man to man, city to city, country to country at the speed of runner, horse, or ship. The power to read and write shouldn't be underestimated, because Monteregione may have had its stone towers and armed guards, but by the end of the Middle Ages, the real political power was in the hands of those who could grasp the meaning and the use of the written word. The translation of sacred and secular texts from Latin into the language of the people extended the availability of information a little, but documents still had to be copied laboriously by hand, limiting the number that could be produced. A new technology changed all this. The appetite of the printing press encouraged writers to produce work specially for the new machine, and, appropriately, they wrote about the modern world, books about science, medicine, architecture, and natural history, as well as Bibles and official texts. But the printed message takes time to get from creator to recipient. A warning shout is instantaneous, but tends to fade or attenuate over distance. Everything does. A candle is warm and bright close up, but feeble and dim when seen from afar. However, if a shout is repeated by someone close enough to hear it, or a beacon lit on a far hillside to pass on the signal, the speed and distance of the messages are limited only by the time taken to repeat them. This renewal of information at each stage was seized upon by a French engineer called Chappe. He devised a visual semaphore in the early 1790s. Towers were built across France, each in sight of the next. Movable arms worked by ropes produced symbols that could be seen through telescopes and repeated. It took just 3 minutes to send news of invasion 180 miles. Of course, it helped if the enemy arranged the invasion on a clear day. Electricity travels at the speed of light, and by the middle of the 18th century, it was possible to produce sparks and flashes. Electrical sparks or flashes are fine, but on their own, they don't mean much. To convey any useful information, they've got to be arranged in some order or some code that the receiver can understand. Although not the first, the best example is the Morse code, long and short bursts of power. Again, repeater stations had to be used because resistance in the wires caused the signals to fade, rather like our shout. But clear dot-dash information could be sent from London to Calcutta by the 1870s, whatever the weather, the terrain, even under the oceans. Trade, military command, news, all forms of reporting and instruction now depended on a network of slender cables that spread with unprecedented speed across the globe. Even so, the speed of the information was still restricted by the rate at which the operator could press the key. This helped solve that problem. Holes punched in a particular order meant that messages could be built up and fed into a machine which could read the holes faster than any human operator could press the key. Wasn't a new idea. When Chappe was sending his visual signals across France, another French inventor, Jacquard, was devising a weaving machine which repeated patterns encoded in punched waxed cards. Machines which could read tape got faster, but the business of punching the holes by hand still limited the speed at which information could be fed into the telegraph wires. And to start with, only one signal could be sent down each wire at a time. This rather unlikely device, the Bodo wheel, was an attempt to solve the problem. 3 or 4 operators would sit close to each other, and as the wheel revolved, each operator in turn would be given a moment's access to the cable. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, obviously, the operators had to get their act together because they would be sitting at a keyboard like this with the information they had to send in front of them. They'd hear a click which would tell them they were connected, so they'd send the information. Then they'd wait for another click and send a bit more information. Imagine doing that all day long. Methods of dividing up access to a cable, methods like this one, became known as time division multiplexing. But rapid communication still depended on an expert operator sending your message. The real breakthrough came with this, the telephone. It's hardly possible to imagine a world without it. Its inventor, Alexander Graham Bell, was working in America on another system for sending many telegraph signals down one wire. He was also interested in the problems of the deaf, and his research centered on changes in frequency or pitch, rather like this. He was trying to develop what he called a harmonic telegraph, which would send a number of different signals at the same time, each at a different pitch. It's what we now call frequency division multiplexing. After several experiments, Bell managed to transmit his own voice by making it move a diaphragm in front of a magnet. This induced a minute voltage change, which could be detected in an earpiece at the other end of 2 wires, reversing the process. So, the voice, or at least a tinny version, could just be heard. Acceptance of this new technology was, to say the least, uneven. In America, phones, as they became known, spread like wildfire. Even bedrooms had them. For the Europeans, the telephone was often seen as an intrusion, an unwelcome visitor to the privacy of the Victorian home. The British managed to stifle the early development of the telephone with some inept tariffs and some pretty cumbersome legislation. This is the telephone book for 1898 for Britain, the whole of Britain. And a look at the list of subscribers tells us a lot about the way the systems were installed. The tariffs were organised in favour of businesses and excluded private subscribers by charging a rental rather than for the number of calls that were made. Even so, Bell's telephone quickly crossed the class barriers. It had the potential to put every man in contact with every other man, and instantly. Staggeringly complex yet reliable systems resulted, and Bell's analogue of the voice was amplified, frequency modulated, stored, switched, enhanced, scrambled, and taken for granted by every user. If we could see what was going down a telephone, it would look like this, a varying wave of electrical energy created, in this case, by my voice. Now you can imagine how difficult it is to keep each caller's weak and wobbling signal intact. Well, in 1936, one man said, "Why bother?" His name was Alec Reeves, and like Bell, his creative and inventive mind came up with an idea which technology took years to develop. It works like this. Let's freeze part of this signal. Reeves' idea was to measure this wave in a very special way. For simplicity, I'll redraw it on this pad. That's roughly right. Now, time runs in this direction. And the height, or amplitude of the signal, is measured in this direction. For argument's sake, we'll divide it up into 100. 50, 0, 100, 75, 25. Now, if we sample the wave at regular intervals of time, like this, we'll end up with a series of values against the amplitude scale on the left. So this first section is rising from about 60 to 75. The next number is also 75. Obviously it's much more accurate in practice. 80, 85, and so on. Now, if we turn the value of these samples into binary numbers, we end up with a series of noughts and ones. For example, that first one there is 70. That's 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0. 80 is 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, and so on. Now, this is the clever bit. These zeros and ones can be turned into on-off pulses. Send them down a line, reconstitute them at the other end, and we have the voice signal that we started with. The elegance of this system is the precise, incorruptible nature of the binary signal. If we take our samples often enough, what we hear sounds exactly like our original signal. In fact, today we can do it so quickly that thousands of signals can be sent down a cable. A modern version of that old mechanical method of time division multiplexing, but millions of times faster. It's called pulse code modulation, and it forms the basis of every modern development in telecommunications. Not only does it mean we can send more signals more accurately down a telephone wire, it also brings these into the story: computers. They can digest any type of code, as long as it's digital. Indeed, for some jobs, they still use punch cards, just like Jacquard's loom. Computers are powerful devices for storing and manipulating information with incredible speed and accuracy. The capacity of an installation like this, for example, is 9.2 gigabytes. That means it can store 9,200 million pieces of information. Until recently, such power was confined to the air-conditioned privacy of the computer room, and only a few experts had access to it. Now that data and speech can travel in the same digital network, this resource should become available to far more of us. The cables, the highways down which this information will travel, are not metal, but glass. The signal is not carried by electricity, but by light. The cable starts life as a tube of ultra-pure glass through which special gases are passed. These tubes are drawn into rods which are stretched and stretched until each is as fine as a human hair. They carry light from a laser. That light is pulsing millions of times a second in that on-off code devised by Alec Reeves. A combination of digital technology and optical fiber gives us a communication system of almost unlimited potential. Indeed, some scientists say optical communication is at the same stage in its development as radio was in the days of the crystal set. This information explosion will have profound repercussions. Automation will reduce jobs. Information technology will create others. So we must be prepared to expect changes which are as significant as those of the past. Some say cities like this will die, others that they will prosper. Our freedom and our future depends on our ability to use these technologies creatively. We cannot know what will happen, and it's being unable to predict that makes it all so exciting. What matters, of course, is the quality of the information, who controls it, and what it's used for. It's in everyone's interest to find out about these new technologies. There's a need for a new literacy and a new understanding. For the first time in man's history, we've arrived at a point where if a technologist thinks of something, it can be done. We are not victims of this new technology. We are its creators and controllers. As it becomes cheaper, more people will have access. And more importantly, we'll be able to decide whether or not we want it. And that is the real freedom.